We are looking at this book of Nehemiah. It's a story of after the Babylonian exile, when the Jews came back to Jerusalem, they found the place was destroyed. The wall was broken down, the gates to the city were all destroyed, and Nehemiah set about rebuilding those gates. And we're talking about leaving a legacy for the future of not just our church, but of our community. Jesus said, if you had faith but the size of a mustard seed, you could say to that mountain over there, well, there's no mountains in Florida. Just imagine there's a mountain over there. You could say to that mountain over there, move from this spot to that spot, and the mountain would be moved. Nehemiah was a man of faith. And because of his faith, an amazing legacy was left. And so this morning I want to talk about when the mountain starts to move. And I want to look at the different types of faith that Nehemiah had and how we might learn from him. First, we need to talk about the faith that Nehemiah had to wait. Nehemiah had the faith to wait. It says it was in the month of Nisan in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about when Nehemiah's brother came back from leading groups of people back from Babylon to Jerusalem, and he asked his brother what Jerusalem was like, and his brother told him the shape of the city, and Nehemiah wept. Now, if it was me, I would have hopped on my donkey that afternoon and headed out. But you see, Nehemiah had the faith to wait. This month of Nisan is about 5 or 6 months after that first story we heard last week about Nehemiah's brother returning. You see, Nehemiah had the faith to wait. He knew that you had to be prepared if you were going to do this great task. And so we can learn from him that sometimes we have to wait a bit. Sometimes we have to pray. Sometimes we have to count the cost. Sometimes we have to make sure we've got everything all planned. Well, Nehemiah showed us that there's some things that we can do while we're waiting. First, Nehemiah showed us that while you're waiting, continue to serve. You see, he continued serving the king and continued having the king's ear. Remember that you have the king's ear as well, and that you can take the time when you're waiting for God to clarify what legacy He wants you to leave to pray and to serve Him. We need to continue to serve and contemplate what it is that God wants us to do. Secondly, Nehemiah showed us that while you're waiting, don't get too comfortable. The king asked him, "Why the long face? You're not sick, are you? Or are you depressed?" That made me all the more agitated. You see, too often if we wait a little while, we can find our way into the living room and find ourselves in that nice big overstuffed lazy boy chair. And we can find that once we get in that nice big chair, it's very difficult to get out of it. We need to not get too comfortable with the situation that we have, both here at our church and in our community. There's some things that can be done. There's some lives that can be changed. While we're waiting, we need to think about what it is that we need to do and not get too comfortable in the waiting process. And finally, Nehemiah shows us that while we're waiting, we need to not lose our passion. I said, "Long live the king. Why shouldn't I be depressed when the city where all my family is buried, is in ruins and the city gates have been reduced to cinders?" Though Nehemiah had waited 5 or 6 months to approach the king with his request, he was still passionate about what had happened to his city. I hope that over the next few weeks as we're going through the book of Nehemiah, that you'll think very hard about what kind of legacy that you might leave for the future of our church and of our community. And I hope that you'll keep passionate about what it is that God calls you to do. We need to have the faith to wait, and we also need to have the faith to ask. You see, Nehemiah had the faith to ask. Then I said, if it please the king, provide me with letters that authorize my travel. He not only asked that the king would let him go and do this, but he asked for help from the king. We need to not be afraid to ask God what it is that He wants us to do. I'm convinced that 50 years from now, in the year 2068, Grace Presbyterian Church will be going strong. It'll be even stronger than it is now because the people in our church today are leaving a legacy for the future. And I think it's important that we ask God, okay, so what is it that you want us to do? And when we ask, there's some things we need to not be afraid of. Don't be afraid to ask for everything that you need. Sometimes we're shy about asking God for stuff. We need to make sure that we don't be shy, that we ask for everything we need. Not only did he ask for letters to get himself through the enemy territory, but he asked that the king would allow his own forester to cut down timbers so that he would have wood to build the gates and to rebuild the temple ceiling and even to build a house for himself. Don't be afraid to ask for everything that you need. You might be contemplating something that you want to do for the future of our church. Don't be afraid to ask for everything that you need. And once you ask for everything that you need, don't be afraid to get everything you asked for. The amazing thing about God is that He always supplies our needs. And when you ask, don't be afraid to get it because you're going to get it. You need to know what to do with it. And not only are you going to get everything you need, but God's going to give you everything you need and more. The king even sent along a cavalry escort. Not only did he give them the time to go and rebuild the wall, not only did he give them the letters to get him through the enemy territory, not only did he give them the timbers to do the building that they needed to do, because they had to bring their own woods. They didn't have a Home Depot in Jerusalem at that time. There may be there one now, but then they didn't have one. But God's not only going to supply what you need, He's going to supply what you need and more. And finally, don't be afraid to deal with dissension. When they heard about this, they were very upset, angry that anyone would come to look after the interests of the people of Israel. I hope that you're planning on leaving a legacy for our church and our community. And I hope that when you begin sharing it with folks, you steal your wits. Not S-T-E-A-L, S-T-E-E-L. Because once you start telling people what you want to do, they're going to go, that'll never happen. You're absolutely crazy. What's wrong with you? Because every time you decide to do something good, people go, that's crazy. Why are you doing that? There's something wrong with you. Don't let it stop you. Don't let it diminish you. People are going to complain. They're going to laugh. They're going to think you're crazy. They thought Nehemiah was crazy too. Well, not only did Nehemiah have the faith to wait and the faith to ask, Nehemiah also had the faith to challenge others. He went to the locals and he said, hey, I'm going to rebuild the wall. God is with me. Can you join me? And they said, you betcha. We're ready to go right now. But when you ask others to help, when you challenge them to be involved in the legacy vision that you have, be prepared to go out of your way. You see, Nehemiah had to sneak out at night and survey the walls all the way around because he didn't want people to see what he was doing and go so much against him that he couldn't get it done. You might have to go out of your way a little bit. You might have to work really hard. You might have to think really hard, which sometimes is a whole lot harder than working really hard. But don't be afraid to go out of your way. And finally, be prepared to convince others of your calling. Be prepared to tell everybody what your idea for a legacy is and be ready to convince them. Because remember, they're going to think you're absolutely nuts. But if God has called you and you're doing something to enhance His kingdom in this place, if you're able to convince folks to join you, they'll join you. And the legacy that you might leave will be multiplied. You see, about 50 years ago, Grace Presbyterian Church started. And a group of crazy people thought, we can build a church here in this place. I'm sure their neighbors laughed at them and thought they were crazy. But it wasn't very long before Grace Presbyterian Church was a going business. And the legacy of faith that those folks left is not only all of the wonderful buildings that we have on this piece of property, because they're all paid for, but it's the amazing ministries that have changed this community forever. I'll give you one example. Every Tuesday and Wednesday, a bunch of crazy people meet out in the garage fixing bicycles. And I'm sure that when they started that program, everybody thought they were absolutely nuts because it's hot out there. But then some folks' lives were changed. They were given a means of transportation that they never had before. We don't charge for those bikes. We give them away free. If you're in this community and you need a bicycle to get to work or to get to school or to get around town, all you got to do is come and ask. We'll give you a bike. We don't even ask any questions. Think over the years how many lives have been changed because a bunch of crazy people are sitting out in the heat fixing bicycles. Add that to all the other ministries that this church has been doing, and lives have been changed. My hope is that in the year 2068, when Grace Presbyterian Church is celebrating its 100th anniversary, those folks will gather together in their celebration and say, look at all the amazing things that the folks who celebrated that 50th anniversary did for our church and our community. May God bless us as we consider how we might leave a legacy for the future.